All right, good afternoon and thank you. This is the effect of sodium bicarbonate supplementation on VO2 max and ramp cycling test in performance in collegiate cyclists. I'm Stephen Charles Zamastil, better known as Charlie Zamastil, and my co-author for this was Frank B. Wyatt. I'm the director and head coach of the varsity cycling program at Midwestern State University, and Frank is a full professor of exercise physiology at the same institution. We also are both avid cyclists. I have the higher VO2 max, mostly thanks to being 30 years younger, but I'm pretty sure he does more miles every year, even still. So in this experiment, we had 7 participants, 6 male and 1 female, and each of them made 3 trips in total to the Hotter Than Hell Cycling Performance Lab here at MSU to perform graded exercise trials, formerly known as ramp tests, while connected to the core cardio coach, which is the machine that performs our gas exchange analysis. The protocol began with 10 minutes of a free ride, so they were allowed to pedal at a unfixed resistance, however hard that they wanted to go, though they were advised to do so fairly easily since they're about to engage in a maximal test. And then we adopted a format developed by the Australian Institute of Sport, which begins with 5 minutes at a fixed resistance wattage of 150 watts for the males, 125 watts for the females. And then after the opening 5 minutes, the resistance increases by 25 watts every minute until the athlete reaches volitional fatigue. So here's a visualization of the setup, what they were doing there. That looks like at 425 watts is probably toward the end of one of our athlete sets. Yeah, so volitional fatigue, they just can no longer pedal their bike. At the first lab visit, the anthropometrics were taken. So height, weight, that sort of thing. And the first ramp test was performed for familiarization with this protocol. 7 days later, we began the randomized double-blind controlled crossover trial, where they received either the experimental solution or a placebo that consisted of 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight of sodium bicarbonate mixed with Gatorade and a couple other flavorings. As their coach, I controlled their levels of training fatigue leading into both that performance and the subsequent one so that they were very equal. We timed the performance to conclude 70 to 80 minutes based on how long we expected them to go following the completion of that solution. And so that should correspond with the peak blood bicarbonate ion concentration after consuming that solution. For further control, participants were kept unaware of their gas exchange values and they received no encouragement. Neither could they wear earbuds or listen to any music. Their only feedback was this sort of screen that you see here from Zwift. So they knew how hard they were going and how long they had been going, but that was it. And is consistent with lab policy, there is absolutely no dancing. So here's a fixed visualization of the setup. I sat at that computer there reading the values. They had the fan going and the screen, and that was all. And so what we're attempting to look at here is to understand how baking soda, right, sodium bicarbonate, is going to affect cycling performance. It is fairly well established that its use as an ergogenic aid in anaerobic activities lasting up to 7 minutes or so is encouraged. It's an ingredient in a lot of over-the-counter and consumer pre-workout supplemental aids that are especially marketed toward power sport athletes. But several studies have also suggested it could aid in aerobic performance in activities leading or lasting up to 1 hour. However, some of these ergogenic effects can be mitigated by the fact that baking soda itself tends to upset people's stomachs, right? There's gastrointestinal distress associated with its use. We're also looking at VO2 max because I personally use it as a coach to evaluate my athletes on their current form, as well as potential recruits, athletes toward their aerobic potential. The AT is the anaerobic threshold, and we're looking at that as well. It corresponds with a number of physiological changes. It's the point at which the ratio of exhaled CO2, called the RER, respiratory exchange ratio, is greater than 1. It's the point at which lactate production outstrips the clearance, so the rate of so the ratio of lactate to pyruvate increases. It's the point at which your blood acidosis accelerates, and you get more endogenous sodium bicarbonate production. So it's also something that your body produces, and we'll go into that a little bit. But that increases to try to sort of attenuate that acidosis, so offset that drop in blood pH. So speaking of, this is the bicarbonate buffer system. I think my video is covering there we go. So you can see the Cori cycle there, how exogenous or how endogenous, so the sodium bicarbonate increases lactate ion efflux, which is key to gluconeogenesis. The bicarbonate buffer system, so it goes back and forth, right? It's trying to control rapid changes in blood pH. So, the body has several other buffering systems to help control this, but the bicarbonate one is the most important, especially as it relates to the blood pH drops associated with intense exercise. So what this does is essentially it prolongs one's ability to produce more energy through glycolysis. And bicarbonate also is thought to increase the rate or improve the rate at which glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, the two ways we derive glucose in the blood in order to produce ATP. So it aids in all of that production. And so what we're trying to discern from this experiment, is in what ways does sodium bicarbonate affect these collegiate cyclist performance during this ramp test? Does time to exhaustion on the ramp test go up if we supplement it? What are some other changes, particularly in the composition of that exhaled gas that is being analyzed by the core cardio coach? Do GI symptoms stem from some, or do they offset the performance benefits? So it would be great if it could improve your individual pursuit time, but if you're going to be throwing up or need to go to the bathroom during your test, that's obviously going to negate that performance aid. And does sodium bicarbonate supplementation reveal certain deficiencies in the AIS protocol, particularly with respect to revealing a true maximum VO2? So something that is sometimes in the research referred to as a plateau or a peak VO2. So in other words, this test, the increase goes up 25 watts every minute. And so let's say they're at 400 watts and they're able to do this. At that point, are we at a sub-maximal VO2 at that workload, but the next step up being 425 watts? Is that test so high as to compel the cyclist to have to stop before they reach a true VO2 max? So if they're at 80 at 400 and it goes up to 425 and they have to stop, could they have gone up to, let's say, 81 or 82, but because of that workload, they weren't able to? So the thinking goes that sodium bicarbonate may be able to boost that, that peak end performance so that we get a true VO2 max. So my participants look like this with the mean and standard deviation there. These were relatively young, and I would point out that I also participated. I am subject one or participant one in this study, and I am 7 years older than my oldest other participant. So I jacked up the average age by like 2.5 years. But I fit in regards to some of the other respects. So a height at 178 centimeters, that's about 5'10", 5'11", roughly 70 kilos, and a VO2 max of 76.4 plus or minus 16.1 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Looking at that visually, you can see here the 7 different subjects. You'll note the much lower VO2 max on subject 6, where she stands well below a full standard deviation below. That is because she is a female cyclist, and females tend to have lower VO2 maxes. But also she is our cyclist who is rated at the lowest category that participated in this. So in cycling, there are 5 different categories for both men and women, and she is considered a category 5. Almost every other participant in this trial is a category 1, with one exception being one category 2, and more than or nearly half of them have or currently ride professionally. So these are pretty elite athletes. Here's the VO2 max again. You can see how that one female's VO2 max tends to stand out a little bit. But even then at 45.9 is exceptionally high for a female athlete. Okay, so here are the results from the max test. I'll give you kind of an extra second or two to look at that. The two highlighted rows at the bottom for each, the experimental treatment and the placebo, show the group averages and standard deviation. Hopefully you see some of the figures that stand out there, the VO2 at AT, the AT time, the AT watts, and the amount of time after AT, as well as that maximum RER, respiratory exchange ratio. So those are the physiological challenges there, or changes there. And then here are our GI symptoms. So we rated 7 of those, I believe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, excuse me. 8 different gastrointestinal distress symptoms. And they were asked to score them on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being nothing at all and 10 being an emergency. So there were some interesting significant changes, or some interesting correlations, excuse me, and lack of correlations that we found between the amount of time that the participants spent beyond their anaerobic threshold and how much the VO2 max subsequently increased. So we're looking at the average, or the different subjects here scattered, and then the linear relationship graphed by that line of best fit. And the R-squared value in the experimental group was 0.66. So that shows that there was a pretty strong relationship in the experimental group between time spent above anaerobic threshold in the RAM test and the change in the VO2 that followed. So as they proceeded along the test, the VO2, their VO2, the amount of volume of O2 that they were utilizing in their body, went up, as would be expected. Strangely enough, in the placebo trial, so these are the same participants, there was a much weaker correlation between those. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting thing. And if you compare that to the change in VO2 max, so the maximum VO2 that they reached, as a function of the amount of time that they spent after anaerobic threshold. So that point at which they reached anaerobic threshold, and then how much it goes up. That was almost perfectly linearly related, and it matched. So in the placebo group, you can see they hit the anaerobic threshold earlier, but it went up by about the same degree. And in the experimental group, same rate, same ramp. So there were strong similarities between the groups there that didn't exist in that previous graph, the change in VO2 max as a function of anaerobic threshold. Okay, some of the other results. In terms of significant changes between the groups, we found differences. In the experimental group, the anaerobic threshold occurred earlier, as I said, and therefore at a lower wattage. So it was an average of 57 watts lower. And so that corresponds to, with a 25 per minute up, a time of 2:09, so over 2 minutes earlier. And then the time interval, of course, matches that. So the interval between anaerobic threshold and exhaustion went up in the experimental group by 2 minutes and 9 seconds. The VO2 value, so at the moment that the AT was significantly different, lower in the experimental group than in the placebo. So from the time that they hit the VO2 value was lower at AT. And then the last one there, the maximum respiratory exchange ratio, so the amount of exhaled CO2 as compared to O2, which we know to go up with increased workload, particularly when we hit that 1.0 value, that is the AT, it's much higher when we introduce that exogenous sodium bicarbonate. So here's a graphical representation of all the different variables that we looked at and the p-values for each of them. In red, we've got the values that were not significant at all. The yellow ones were ones that approached significant. So obviously with the sample size of just 7 participants, you know, we're not wielding a lot of statistical power here, but I would love to continue this experiment as I get new athletes every single semester. So that we're going to keep this going. And then the green values are the ones that I just mentioned that had the statistically significant changes, and their accompanying p-values are right there. So what have I concluded, right? Well, the bottom 2 of these particularly germane to me as a coach, and unfortunately, we didn't establish that there's a change in VO2 max associated with sodium bicarbonate supplementation. But we also find that it didn't increase GI distress in any significant way. So while we haven't proven any definite ergogenic benefit to these to this very inexpensive supplement, right? That's one of the other reasons to look at sodium bicarbonate, is it as it is much cheaper than a lot of other workout powders and things like that. But it didn't cause any major issues either. The scientist in me is intrigued by the boldface conclusion up at the top, though, that exogenous sodium bicarbonate increases the concentration of CO2 in the exhaled gases during exercise. And so what implications can we draw from that? One implication is from the study is that the AIS protocol does seem to elicit a proper VO2 max. And the second one would be that metabolic acidosis, which we know is attenuated by sodium bicarbonate, doesn't really seem to be the direct cause of the fatigue or the failure at the end of this VO2 max test. Right, so they didn't go any longer when they had the sodium bicarbonate. So even though we can assume that their blood pH, which we were unable to measure for this study, I did not have clearance for that, as I'm a coach, not an exercise physiologist working in the lab. But we would want to look at that blood pH. We assumed that it went, that the drop in pH was attenuated, and yet they still hit fatigue at pretty much the exact same point. Other avenues of study or questions that I have following this. Would we see similar impacts with respect to the CO2 exhalation, right? There's more CO2 coming out if it were sustained sub-threshold exercise, or would that increase in CO2 being exhaled actually prolong it, right? Because you're expelling more of that, more hydrogen ions and getting rid of the CO2, which we know CO2 to also cause fatigue. So if you're getting rid of it, is that because there's more in there? Or is it because you're doing a better job of getting rid of it? Additionally, with the corresponding, so I talked about the blood test, and sorry, that was my second one. And then would shortening the ramp test result in similar findings, right? So I would consider getting rid of the initial 15 minutes of the test, the 10 minutes of free ride, and the opening 5 minutes at 150 or 125 watts, and just jump right into the ramping up of this test, and to see if there's more benefit from since we know sodium bicarbonate to work on intervals, under 7 minutes. Let's shorten up that test and see if we see any ergogenic benefit for a shorter test that we didn't see so much in the longer test. All right, let's see if they can go higher. So 150 watts for these athletes and 125 for our female. That is essentially a warm up. That is exceptionally easy. They could sustain that for in excess of 5 hours without being significantly fatigued. Okay, so that is my presentation. I want to acknowledge the members of the MSU cycling team. All the participants, they're not necessarily pictured in the background. That's just a random photo I pulled, and I like it. Thank you to Pablo, one of our participants, who also was the one who administered the test on me, since I was one of the subjects, and my wife, Lucille, for participating in the masking of the solutions. So she was the one that enabled me to do a double-blind study. So very much thanks to her. And additionally, I want to thank Georgia Celeste Zamastil. She's at 36 hours, our youngest conference attendee by far, I'm fairly certain. And she was very quiet while I made this recording. So thank you to her. She's a very good girl. And so in the famous words of Jeb Bush, please clap.